Chapter 1. The last snowfall of my grandparents, I used to believe family meant safety. Sunday dinners, laughter echoing through the halls, promises that love could fix anything. But that illusion shattered the day my grandparents' car never made it home. I thought grief would be the hardest thing I'd face until their lawyer read the will. $28 million, all left to me. Not to my father who ran the company, not to my mother who chased headlines, but to the quiet daughter they once ignored. That was the moment love turned into calculation, and blood became the sharpest weapon of all. That was before everything I believed about love, loyalty, and family unraveled. Snow was falling the day everything changed. Thick, heavy flakes floated through the quiet streets of Aspen Ridge, settling on the pine trees and the rooftops that had shaped most of my childhood. I could still see my grandfather's truck parked in the same spot by the old fence, its hood dusted white like it always was in winter. The house stood there, calm and familiar, as if it refused to believe the world had just become smaller. I used to love snow. When I was a child, my grandmother Evelyn would wrap me in her big red coat and pull me outside, laughing while we tried to catch snowflakes on our tongues. She'd always say snow made the world honest, because it covered both the rich and the poor the same way. My grandfather Walter would watch us from the porch, coffee in hand, smiling like he already knew the lesson she was teaching. He built his company, Whitmore Freight and Logistics, from one truck and a promise. He used to say, "The most valuable thing isn't money, Clara, it's what you do with it." I never really understood that until I saw how the rest of my family lived. My father, Thomas, was the numbers man, the kind of man who counted affection like profit margins. My mother, Linda, was the face, always camera ready, always one step away from pretending. Together, they loved success, the way some people love oxygen. They thought my choice to teach elementary school was a waste of the Whitmore name. "A Whitmore in a classroom?" my father once said. "That's like putting a diamond in a mud pie." I laughed back then. I don't laugh at that memory anymore. The accident happened just after Christmas in 2023. They were driving back from a charity dinner in Boulder, a night filled with speeches and toasts I was supposed to attend but skipped because of a parent-teacher conference. The driver who hit them was drunk, speeding down an icy road. The police report said it was instant. I remember reading the words twice before I could breathe again. Instant, as if time itself refused to witness what happened. The funeral was a blur of black coats and fake sympathy. I remember standing beside their caskets while people who hadn't spoken to them in years cried louder than anyone else. My father's phone buzzed twice during the service. He answered it. I heard him whisper something about company shares. My mother leaned toward him, hissing softly, "At least wait until the reception, Tom." Then, as the photographer approached, she fixed her hair and said through clenched teeth, "Make sure they get my good side." I turned away before the flash went off. I don't remember much after that, just the cold, the kind that seeps through your coat and into your bones, the kind that makes you realize grief isn't loud, it's quiet, patient, and cruelly polite. After everyone left, I stayed. I stood at their graves long after the last car drove away. The wind had picked up, sweeping snow across the headstones like white sand. I whispered into the emptiness, "You were the only ones who ever saw me." My voice cracked. It didn't matter. No one was listening. 2 days later, my parents called a family meeting at the house. They said the lawyer wanted us all to gather for some legal formality. I drove up to Denver in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel, until my knuckles turned pale. The city lights blurred through the windshield, and for a moment, I imagined my grandparents sitting beside me the way they used to when I was 16, teaching me how to drive. My grandmother would have said, "Steady hands, steady heart, Clara." My grandfather would have smiled in the mirror. When I arrived, the house looked even colder than before. My father greeted me with that kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Glad you made it, he said. My mother hugged me, her perfume sharp and familiar. You look tired, she said, her voice dripping with the kind of concern that always felt staged. In the corner of the living room, a man stood waiting, holding a leather folder. Henry Lawson. He was my grandfather's attorney and his closest friend since college. He was older now, gray at the temples, but his eyes still had the same steady kindness I remembered from childhood dinners. When I was little, he used to bring me peppermint candies and tell me stories about how my grandfather once drove cross-country with nothing but a map and a dream. Clara, he said softly when everyone had settled, they left you more than you think. Be prepared. I frowned, not fully understanding what he meant. My father's head snapped toward him. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. Henry only shook his head. You'll know soon enough. But I suggest you take a few days before we meet again. My father's jaw tightened. My mother exchanged a glance with him that said everything words couldn't. They already sensed the shift, the imbalance. Something was about to tilt in their world, and they could feel it. After Henry left, no one spoke for a while. My father poured himself a drink, swirling the glass. I suppose he means the will, he muttered. And if your grandparents left anything stupid, we'll fix it. He didn't look at me when he said it. I stood near the window, staring at the snow starting to fall again outside. The lights of the city blurred into soft halos through the glass. It was beautiful in that distant, unreachable way beauty sometimes is. That night, I drove back to Aspen Ridge alone. The highway was empty, the kind of quiet road where you could almost hear your thoughts if you weren't afraid to. I thought about the sound of my grandmother's laugh, the way she used to hum while cooking, the smell of cinnamon on winter mornings. I thought about my grandfather's hands, strong and weathered, always smelling faintly of engine oil and pine soap. And I thought about how, somehow, they were gone and yet everything around me still existed as if nothing had changed. When I pulled into their driveway, the porch light flickered on automatically. The snow had covered the welcome mat, just like it always did. I stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking softly under my boots. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. On the mantel, the framed photograph of them was still there. My grandmother's arm was looped around my grandfather's, both of them smiling as the snow fell behind them. I picked up the frame and brushed off the thin layer of dust that had settled over the glass. The silence in the room pressed against me until I could barely breathe. My reflection stared back at me through the glass, blurred and small beside their frozen smiles. My voice broke before I could stop it. That was the day they left me everything, even the fight I never asked for. Chapter 2. The $28 million will. The next 2 weeks passed in a fog of routine and avoidance. I went to work, smiled for my students, graded papers, and answered every "I'm sorry for your loss" with the same polite nod. At night, I sat by the fireplace in my grandparents' house, reading the notes my grandmother had left scattered in cookbooks and drawers. Each one ended with a heart or a line about kindness. None of them mentioned the company or the money, only lessons about patience and truth. Then the call came. Henry's voice was calm as always. He said the reading of the will would be held at his office in Aspen Ridge, and my presence was mandatory. My stomach tightened the way it always did before something irreversible. I thanked him and hung up. That night, I stared at the snow outside the window and tried to picture what they might have left me. Maybe the house, maybe a few heirlooms. I didn't think much about the company. My father would never let it go. The morning of the meeting was gray and wet, the kind of morning that smelled like old rain and metal. I drove downtown, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The office sat in a narrow brick building near Main Street, a plaque by the door that read, "Lawson and Finch Attorneys at Law." I saw my parents' black SUV already parked out front, gleaming as if it knew who it belonged to. When I walked in, everyone was already there. My father stood by the window with a cup of coffee, his tie perfectly straight. My mother sat next to him, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone with a manicured thumb. Eric was slouched in his chair, tapping his foot against the table, his restlessness louder than words. Aunt Maggie, my grandmother's younger sister, wore too much perfume and smiled too hard. Uncle Steve sat beside her, quiet, his gaze flicking toward me with something like sympathy before he looked away. "Nice of you to join us," my father said without turning from the window. I took a seat opposite them and nodded toward Henry, who was arranging folders on the polished wooden desk. He looked at me briefly, his expression unreadable. Then he cleared his throat and began to read. "This is the last will and testament of Walter and Evelyn Whitmore. Being of sound mind and body, we make the following declarations and bequests." The room felt colder. The air carried a tension that didn't exist before. My mother leaned forward, ready, as if waiting for applause. My father's jaw twitched once. "To our granddaughter, Clara May Whitmore," Henry continued, his voice steady and deliberate. "We leave the family residence, located at 412 Pineview Road, all company shares, under the Whitmore Freight and Logistics Corporation, and all assets held in joint trust, with a total estimated value of $28.5 million. There was a second of silence. Then, the world erupted. My father slammed his hand against the table so hard the coffee in his cup spilled over the edge. "They've lost their minds," he shouted. "She's a teacher, for God's sake." My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You?" she snapped, pointing at me. "You can't even balance your own bills. You'll destroy everything they built." Eric laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "She'll give it all away to her poor little students. That's what she does, right? Feeds stray cats and sad kids?" I felt my pulse pounding in my throat, but I stayed silent. I wanted to stand, to tell them they were wrong, but something told me to wait. Henry was still holding a folder in his hands. "If I may," he said, raising his voice just enough to be heard, "there is one more thing." He reached for the remote and pressed a button. The lights dimmed slightly as a video began playing on the screen behind him. The image flickered before settling on my grandfather's face. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were kind and certain. "If you're watching this," Walter said, his tone calm and measured, "then Evelyn and I are gone. We made this decision together. We leave everything to Clara because she understands value beyond money. She knows the difference between legacy and greed. We trust her to protect what we built, not for wealth, but for purpose." The video ended. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her purse. "This is insane," she muttered. "They must have been manipulated." My father glared at Henry. "We'll contest this. Every line of it. You think some video makes it legal?" Henry straightened his tie. "It's notarized, witnessed, and filed in accordance with Colorado state law. I assure you, it's binding." Eric kicked his chair back. "This is bullshit," he spat, storming toward the door. Maggie leaned toward my father and whispered, "We can fight this, Tom. There are ways." Uncle Steve didn't speak. His eyes met mine briefly, filled with an emotion I couldn't name, something between guilt and pity. My father finally turned to me. "You think you've won something?" His voice was low and sharp. "You'll destroy it in a month." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My hands were trembling under the table, the fabric of my coat clenched between my fingers. Henry looked at me, his eyes softening. "Clara, your grandparents trusted you. Don't let their faith scare you. Let it guide you." My mother scoffed. "Guide her? Please. She needs guidance like a bird needs a leash." I stood up slowly. "I didn't ask for this," I said quietly, "but I won't apologize for it either." My father's face hardened. "We'll sue," he said, "and this time I'll win." Henry exhaled, the weight of decades in his breath. You've already lost, Tom. You just don't know it yet. No one spoke after that. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating vent and the snow tapping against the window. My mother gathered her things in furious silence. My father left first, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. I stayed behind as Henry began collecting the documents. The air in the room felt different now, heavier but somehow clearer. He looked up at me and said quietly, "They'll come for it, Clara. Every piece of it. You need to be ready." I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't feel powerful or rich. I felt small, exposed, and suddenly very alone. When I stepped outside, the snow was falling again, soft and slow. The streets were empty. I walked to my car and sat for a long time before turning the key. In the reflection of the windshield, I saw my own face, pale and still, framed by the white outside. Something inside me had shifted. It wasn't anger yet, not fully. It was colder than that. It was something that would not melt. Chapter 3. When Family Becomes Debt Collectors. The phone rang the following Sunday morning while I was grading essays at the kitchen table. My father's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out. But habit won. His voice was controlled, low, the kind that carried hidden anger behind politeness. He said we needed to meet, that there were financial matters to settle regarding the inheritance. Then, as if I were still a child, he added, "You owe it to the family to show up." I didn't answer right away. The sound of his breathing filled the silence. I finally said I'd come by that evening. His tone softened, almost rehearsed. "Good. We'll have everything ready for you." Their house sat in the wealthiest corner of Denver, all white stone and glass, perched on a hill that overlooked the city like it owned it. I had spent my teenage years here, memorizing the sound of the gates closing behind me every time I came home late from work or class. The house glowed from the driveway, bright and immaculate, like something built to be photographed instead of lived in. Linda opened the door wearing a cream sweater and diamonds that caught the light. She smiled like she was greeting a business partner. "Come in, darling. We have something to discuss." The scent of her perfume hit me before her words did, heavy and sweet. I stepped inside. The living room was spotless, but it felt hollow, too perfect, too clean. The kind of place where no one dared sit on the couch cushions. My father's voice came from the study down the hall. He was waiting at the table, a folder open in front of him. A decanter of whiskey glowed amber under the chandelier. Without a greeting, he gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." I stayed standing. "What is this about?" He pushed a thick stack of papers toward me. "The assets. You need someone experienced to manage them. These forms authorize me to act on your behalf. It's just temporary, until you find your footing." I looked down at the documents. Legal language filled the pages, neat paragraphs written to sound protective, but designed to control. My mother walked in, heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She leaned against the table, her tone calm but cold. "Your father is right. This isn't personal. It's about protecting what our family built. You can't possibly handle the company, the accounts, the taxes. You'd drown in it." Eric came in next, holding a soda can, his hoodie half-zipped. "Just sign it, Clara. Everyone wins. Dad keeps things running. You get your peace of mind, and nobody thinks you manipulated the will." I looked at him. His eyes darted from me to my father. There was fear behind the arrogance. "Is that what people think?" I asked. He shrugged. "People talk. You know how Aspen Ridge is. One wrong story and you're the villain." My father's voice cut through. "Enough talk. Sign." I folded my arms. "No." Thomas's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped lower. "You're making a mistake. You have no business sense, no training, no experience. You'll destroy everything they left behind." "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to learn from. Grandfather trusted me. I'm not handing it back to the people who already ruined enough." He slammed his palm against the table. The whiskey glass trembled. You don't get to lecture me about trust. I was there when he started that company. I helped build it. You think being his granddaughter makes you qualified? I met his stare. No. But being his daughter didn't make you honest. My mother gasped softly, and Eric muttered something under his breath. The air in the room changed, thick with disbelief. Linda straightened. Clara, don't embarrass us like this. Do you even understand how it looks? The board is questioning this already. They think you're naive, that you'll make the family look weak. I'm not interested in the board, I said. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. If you walk out that door without signing, don't bother coming back. The words landed heavier than I expected. For a moment I thought I might cry, but I didn't. I simply nodded. Then I guess that makes this goodbye. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, my mother called out, her voice cracking. Don't do this, Clara. You'll regret it. But I didn't stop. The night air bit through my coat as I stepped outside. Snow was starting to fall again, light at first, then heavier. By the time I reached my car, the driveway was already dusted white. I sat inside with the heater running, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the property management company that owned my apartment. The subject line read, Lease termination. Notice. I opened it. The message was short and clinical, informing me that my lease had been canceled effective immediately due to restructuring of ownership under Whitmore Holdings. My parents' company owned the building. The timestamp on the email showed it had been sent an hour earlier, while I was still sitting at their table. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. Then I started to laugh. It wasn't loud or bitter, it was quiet, exhausted. Of course they would take the roof from over my head. That was how they fought. Not with weapons, but with paperwork. By midnight, I had packed what I could fit into 2 suitcases and a few boxes. Clothes, books, photos, everything else could burn. I left the key on the counter and walked out without looking back. The drive to Aspen Ridge was long and silent. The snow thickened as I climbed higher into the mountains, and the road narrowed until the world felt like it was closing in around me. The headlights caught flakes swirling through the dark, endless and slow, like ashes instead of snow. They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes it's the blood that stains the snow. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I turned onto Pine View Road. The old house appeared through the storm, its outline familiar even in the darkness. I parked, stepped out, and felt the crunch of ice under my boots. The wind cut through the stillness, but the sight of the porch light flickering on felt like a whisper of welcome. Inside, the air was cold and still. I set my bags down and closed the door behind me. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath my feet as I walked toward the living room. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then the motion sensor clicked, and the lights flickered on, one by one. The sound startled me. I turned toward the fireplace. The old intercom speaker, the one my grandparents used to call each other from different rooms, crackled faintly. Then came her voice. Evelyn. Soft, distant, and unmistakable. If you're hearing this, she said, her tone calm but firm, the truth has already begun to surface. The sound faded into silence. I stood there, frozen, the air thick with something between grief and warning. The snow outside kept falling, burying everything it touched. Chapter 4. The House of Secrets. The morning light crept through the curtains, pale and thin. The house was colder than I remembered, the kind of cold that came from emptiness rather than weather. I pulled on a sweater and walked downstairs, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath my feet. The smell of coffee reached me before the sound of the door opening. Carlos Reyes stood in the kitchen, the same way he had for most of my life. His gray hair was tucked under a cap, and his hands were rough from years of work around the property. When I was little, he used to carve toy animals for me out of pine wood, each one polished smooth. Now, he handed me a steaming mug and gave a small nod. "I figured you'd be here," he said. "The place doesn't feel right when it's empty." I took the mug, the warmth seeping into my palms. "How long have you been keeping it up?" "Since the funeral," he said quietly. "They came here after it, you know." My grip tightened on the mug. "Who?" "Your parents, your brother. They showed up the next day, thought no one was here." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. "I recorded everything. I thought you should see it before anyone else does." For a second, I couldn't speak. I just stared at him, the room suddenly feeling smaller. "You recorded them?" He nodded. "You told me once that your grandfather said truth always leaves a mark. I figured this might be the mark." I sat down at the kitchen table. My voice came out low. "Carlos, what did they do?" He hesitated. "It's better if you see." By noon, Henry Lawson arrived. I had called him earlier, my voice barely steady. He drove up through the snow in his old silver sedan, carrying his worn leather briefcase. His face was drawn, his eyes tired, but his tone was calm as always. "I thought this might happen," he said as he set the briefcase on the table. "They never accepted that the will was final." Carlos placed the flash drive beside it. "It's all on there, security cameras and my phone." Henry nodded and plugged it into his laptop. The screen came to life and the footage began to play. The timestamp read 2 days after the funeral. The front door opened and Thomas stepped inside first, his expression sharp and impatient. Linda followed, wearing dark glasses even indoors. Eric came last, glancing around like a thief in his own house. They moved quickly, opening drawers, checking closets, whispering to each other. "Take the jewelry box," my mother's voice said through the speakers. "It's probably worth something." Thomas appeared again, carrying a small safe. "We'll sort it later," he muttered. "Just get everything before anyone notices." Eric was at the bookshelf, stuffing photo frames into a bag. "She won't even know they're gone," he said, laughing. "She never pays attention." My chest tightened. I watched my family move through the house like strangers. They didn't look sad or guilty. They looked determined. When the video ended, the room was silent. The hum of the laptop fan filled the air. Henry leaned back in his chair, his voice low. "This is enough to press charges, Clara. Burglary, theft, trespassing, even tampering with estate property." I didn't answer. The words seemed distant, like they were meant for someone else. My eyes were still on the frozen image of my parents standing in the living room. My father's hand was on the mantel, where my grandmother's photo used to sit. Carlos placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to see that." I nodded, unable to speak. A single tear slipped down my cheek, but it wasn't from fear. It was from something deeper, something that had been waiting to break for years. When Henry finally left, he promised to secure the evidence and file a report if I wanted to move forward. I told him I needed time. After the door closed behind him, the silence in the house grew heavier, settling over me like dust. I wandered into the study, a room that still smelled faintly of my grandfather's cologne. His books lined the shelves in perfect rows. On the desk, half buried under papers, was a wooden box I had never noticed before. The lid was carved with the initials E.W. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside were journals, the handwriting unmistakably my grandmother's. The pages were yellowed and filled with neat, deliberate words. I sat down and began to read. Each entry was dated, stretching back more than a decade. Some were ordinary notes about family dinners, birthdays, the weather, but the further I read, the darker they became. She wrote about loans that Thomas took from the company, about promises to repay that never came. She wrote about how Linda pressured her to invest in failed ventures, and how Eric had used company accounts to fund personal expenses. One entry stopped me cold. It read, "Walter says we must protect Clara. She is the only one who sees clearly. If they ever turn on her, she must know the truth." At the very back of the box was a small folded note, the paper softer than the rest. My grandmother's handwriting was smaller here, as if she had written it in a hurry. "If they return, play Walter's message." I reached back into the box and found a small USB drive taped under the lid. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. The metal felt cold, heavier than it should have. I turned it over in my palm, staring at the faint reflection of my face on its surface. My grandfather's voice echoed faintly in memory. The way he used to call me kiddo when I sat on his lap and watched the snow from this same window. I could almost hear him again, telling me that truth was the only weapon worth keeping. But something inside me hesitated. Maybe it was fear of what I might hear, or maybe it was the finality of it all. I set the USB on the desk and leaned back in the chair. The house was utterly silent now, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Outside, the snow had stopped, the sky had turned pale gray, and the trees stood heavy and still. I could hear the faint groan of the old wood as the house settled, like it was breathing with me. I looked back at the small flash drive on the desk. It waited, patient, unassuming, holding whatever truth my grandparents had left behind. I reached out, but I didn't plug it in. Not yet. Instead, I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet. The house felt alive with secrets, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to know them all. Chapter 5. Rumors, Debts, and the Fall of a Reputation. The first thing I saw the next morning was my own face on the front page of a news site. The headline hit like a slap. "Heiress worth $28 million evicts her own parents." Below it was a photo of me leaving Henry's office after the will reading, my expression caught mid-step, serious enough to look cruel. The article was written by Amanda Green, a reporter who had once attended my mother's charity luncheons. The tone was dramatic, painting my parents as victims and me as some ungrateful daughter who had pushed them into the cold for money. By the time I arrived at school, the whispers had already spread. In the parking lot, a group of parents stood in a small circle, their voices lowering as I walked past. Inside the classroom, my students were buzzing. Children never know how to filter what they hear at home. One of them, a sweet kid named Sophie, looked up at me with wide eyes and asked if I was really rich. I smiled the way teachers do when they're pretending everything is fine and said, "Money doesn't make someone better or worse, sweetheart. It just makes life louder." The kids laughed, not really understanding, and that was good. They didn't need to. Still, by lunchtime I could feel the weight of judgment pressing in from all sides. Some of the other teachers avoided my eyes. One of them, Mrs. Porter, tried to offer sympathy. "The news loves a scandal," she said softly. "They'll move on soon." I nodded, but I knew she was wrong. Scandals like this didn't fade. They spread like frost, slow but permanent. At home that night, I turned on the television and watched as a local news anchor repeated the story, complete with dramatic music and a photo montage of my family. My parents had declined to comment, which somehow made them look nobler. The reporter described me as a reclusive heiress estranged from her family. I almost laughed. They made it sound poetic. My phone rang. It was Henry. His voice carried exhaustion, but also a quiet resolve. "Clara, don't read the comments. It's all noise. They'll twist anything they can." I sank into the couch. "How did they even get that photo?" "I'm guessing your mother's friend Amanda," he said. "She's always been good at selling a narrative. But there's something more important we need to discuss. I've been going over the company's records." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "There are fund transfers that don't make sense. Large ones, some routed through shell accounts, connected to Eric. And there's another thing. I had a friend in finance trace one of the accounts. Eric owes roughly $600,000 to a crypto exchange that's been under investigation. I felt a cold wave rise through me. And my father? He's covering the losses, Henry said, through the company. The room tilted a little. I gripped the armrest to steady myself. He's using corporate money? Exactly. Which means if it surfaces, it won't just ruin him. It could destroy what your grandparents built. I rubbed my temples, the same ache forming behind my eyes that always came when my family was involved. What do we do? Before he could answer, I heard him take a sharp breath. Papers shuffled on the other end. Wait a second, he said quietly. Someone just sent me an email. Anonymous. It says, drop the case, or the next article will be about you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled. They're trying to scare me. They don't know me very well. Henry, maybe you should. No, he interrupted gently. Walter asked me to protect you. That's what I intend to do. After he hung up, I sat in silence. Outside, the snow had started falling again, heavier this time. It pressed against the windows like a slow heartbeat. I stared at the flickering light from the fireplace and wondered how far my parents would go to protect their image. The next afternoon, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, a woman stood there in a long black coat, her hair tied back neatly, her posture straight. She looked familiar, though I couldn't place her right away. Clara Whitmore? She asked. She smiled faintly. I'm Rosa Delgado. I used to work with your grandfather at Whitmore Freight. I ran operations for him before your father took over. May I come in? Her voice carried confidence, not arrogance, the kind that came from surviving long enough to stop needing approval. I let her in. She glanced around the house, her eyes pausing on the old photographs on the wall. He talked about you, she said. Said you had his stubborn streak. That's one way to put it. She laughed softly. Then her expression turned serious. I heard what they're doing to you. The article, the rumors, all of it. I know how this family works. I saw it when your grandfather was alive. They don't stop until you're broken or silent. I leaned against the counter. You fight, she said, but you do it smart. Justice is cleaner when it's quiet. Her eyes met mine, sharp and steady. If you go after them directly, they'll bury you in lawyers and headlines. But companies leave trails. Money leaves trails. Start there. She reached into her bag and handed me a business card. Her name was embossed in silver. Underneath it read, Delgado Consulting, Corporate Investigations. You start with the company. The truth always leaves a paper trail. After she left, I stood by the window, watching her car disappear into the snow. Her words lingered in the air, like the faint echo of a challenge. That night I went to the study, the same one where I had found my grandmother's journals. The box was still on the desk. I opened it again, brushing past the old papers until I reached the bottom. My grandfather's leather-bound ledger was there, worn from years of use. I placed it under the lamp and opened the first page. His handwriting filled the lines, neat, deliberate, the way he had always been. At first it was ordinary shipment dates, client names, transaction amounts. Then I saw it, a series of transfers marked in red ink. Unusual sums, routed through new accounts labeled consulting fees. The handwriting next to them wasn't his. I turned another page, then another. Each one showed more transfers, more dates, all within the last year. One name appeared repeatedly beside them. Thomas Whitmore. My father had signed off on every one. The realization hit like a stone dropping into cold water. I sat back, staring at the pages as if they might rewrite themselves. Outside, the wind rose, pushing against the windows until they rattled. The ledger sat open before me, its truth heavy and undeniable. My father wasn't just greedy, he was desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. Chapter 6. The Last Betrayal. The next few days passed in a blur of silence and strategy. Rosa became a constant presence at the house, moving with quiet precision. She set up her laptop on the dining table, surrounded by files, ledgers, and a portable scanner that hummed softly through the night. I watched her work, her focus unbroken even as the storm outside pounded against the windows. We started small: old invoices, duplicate signatures, files buried deep within the company archives that Henry helped us access through his legal credentials. Each document revealed a trail, small but deliberate, leading back to the same hands. My father's, my brother's, sometimes Linda's name appeared too, next to falsified expenses for public relations that never existed. By the third night, Rosa looked up from her laptop, her expression grim. "They've been running this for years. Your grandfather must have suspected. That's why he left the records hidden here." I sat beside her, flipping through another folder. "He always said truth has a longer memory than lies." She smiled faintly. He was right. Henry visited that weekend, bringing sandwiches and his steady calm. His office had been receiving anonymous phone calls, voices that hung up the moment he answered. "They're nervous," he said. "That's good. Nervous people make mistakes." I handed him the latest batch of papers we'd uncovered. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses and began reading. Page after page, his expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. "These are forged contracts," he murmured. "Fake consulting firms, false signatures, inflated budgets. This could take down the entire board." Rosa nodded. "The beauty of paper is it never lies." Henry exhaled deeply and looked at me. "Clara, if Walter could see this, he'd be proud of you. You're doing what he couldn't finish." For the first time in weeks, I felt warmth rise behind my eyes. He'd probably just tell me to drink some tea and keep going. He laughed softly, but there was something else in his eyes, something like pride mixed with sorrow. Later that night, while Rosa reviewed encrypted files from her laptop, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but the message was simple. "Check your email. It's time you know everything." In my inbox was an attachment from S. Whitmore, my Uncle Steve. I hesitated before opening it, half afraid of what I might find. Steve had always been quiet, the kind of man who tried to keep peace even when it meant pretending not to see the cracks forming around him. The email was short. "Clara, I can't live with this anymore. Your father used the company's trust accounts to pay off Eric's debts. Attached are copies of the transactions. Do what you must. I'm sorry." My hands shook as I opened the files. There it was, black and white, transfers from company funds into offshore accounts, routed to cover Eric's failed crypto investments. Each document was signed by Thomas himself. I forwarded the evidence to Henry. Within an hour, he was at the house again, his coat still damp from the snow. He spread the papers across the table, eyes scanning every line. "This is it," he said quietly. "It's enough to bring formal charges. We'll take it step by step, keep everything documented." The relief I expected didn't come. Instead, a dull ache settled in my chest. This was my family, every signature a betrayal in their own handwriting. The next day, everything unraveled. It was late afternoon when I heard the sound of tires on gravel outside the house. I looked out the window and saw my father's car. The door slammed, his silhouette cut through the falling snow, moving fast toward the porch. Before I could lock the door, he was inside. His face was red, his breath sharp with whiskey. "You think you can destroy us?" he shouted. "You think the company belongs to you because of a piece of paper?" I stepped back. "You've been using it to cover up Eric's mistakes. You took everything grandfather built and turned it into a lie." His jaw tightened. "Everything I did was for him. He's my son. He needed help." You wouldn't understand because you've never had to fight for anything in your life. I felt something inside me break, not from fear, but from years of silence finally cracking open. You think love means covering for his crimes? You think stealing from your own father's company is love? The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, especially when we call them love. He froze, eyes narrowing. Don't talk to me like you're better than us. I'm not, I said quietly. I'm just done pretending this is family. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then his expression changed, the anger fading into something hollow. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The sound of his footsteps faded into the snow until only silence remained. When I finally sat down again, my hands were still shaking. Rosa walked in from the kitchen, her expression calm but knowing. "You did what had to be done," she said. I didn't answer. I went to the study instead, the same place where the ledger still lay open on the desk. My grandmother's journals were stacked neatly beside it, and there, under the lamp, the small USB drive waited. I had avoided it long enough. With a deep breath, I plugged it into my laptop. For a moment, the screen flickered, then came to life. The video began with a faint hum. My grandfather sat in his office, older than I remembered him, his hair white but his eyes still bright. "If you're watching this," he said, "it means the truth found its way back, as it always does. Clara, I know this family has made mistakes, some out of greed, some out of fear, but remember, justice doesn't shout, it endures. Do what is right, not what is easy, and never let the noise drown out your heart." The video ended, and the screen went black. I sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of my face on the monitor. The fear that had followed me for weeks was gone, replaced by something sharper, steadier. I closed the laptop. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was waiting, patient, ready for what came next. Chapter 7. The day justice came quietly. The courthouse stood gray against the winter sky, its steps crowded with reporters holding cameras and microphones. I kept my head down as Henry guided me through the crowd. Rosa followed close behind, her calm presence steadying me more than she realized. I could hear the murmurs, the questions shouted into the cold air, each one more pointed than the last. "Is it true you're suing your family? Do you regret evicting your parents? Will you take the money and run?" Inside, the air was warmer but no less tense. The Colorado State Court's mediation chamber was smaller than I imagined, lined with oak panels and humming with quiet conversation. On one side sat Thomas, Linda, and Eric, their lawyer whispering rapidly between them. My mother refused to meet my eyes. My father looked like a man trying to stay composed, but unraveling at the edges. Eric slouched back in his chair, avoiding everyone's gaze. Henry sat beside me, his briefcase open, papers organized with deliberate precision. Rosa took the seat behind us, her laptop ready, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Uncle Steve entered quietly and nodded to me. His face looked tired but relieved. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the session to order. Cameras were not allowed inside, but a handful of reporters had managed to secure seats in the back. The tension was thick enough to feel. Thomas's attorney began first. His voice was confident, almost rehearsed. He argued that the will was fraudulent, that my grandparents had been manipulated, that I was unfit to manage the inheritance due to emotional instability and lack of financial experience. When he said those words, I felt a wave of heat rise inside me, but Henry rested a hand on my arm. "Let him talk," he whispered. "The truth doesn't need to shout." When our turn came, Henry stood slowly. His voice was steady, deliberate, and every word carried weight. He began by presenting the video message from Walter, and the certified medical records, confirming that both he and Evelyn had been of sound mind when the will was written. The judge read them carefully, then nodded for him to continue. Next, Henry introduced Evelyn's journals. I watched as he handed the leather-bound books to the clerk. The sound of the pages turning filled the room. These journals document years of financial misconduct by the petitioners, he said, including embezzlement, forged contracts, and misuse of company assets. The opposing lawyer objected, but Henry was prepared. We also have digital evidence, he continued. Rosa rose from her seat, walked forward, and placed a flash drive on the evidence table. I was an operations manager under Walter Whitmore, she said clearly. I worked alongside his son for over a decade. I can verify that these records are authentic. They show a pattern of theft that began shortly after Mr. Whitmore's health declined. The judge turned to Rosa. You're willing to testify under oath? Rosa nodded without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor. Henry called the next witness. Uncle Steve took the stand, his voice trembling at first but gaining strength as he spoke. He confirmed the fund transfers, the payments made from company accounts to cover Eric's debts, and the falsified consulting records. I stayed quiet too long, he said softly. But Walter trusted Clara for a reason. She didn't take anything. She's the only one trying to set it right. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them away. Then came the surprise. Henry produced a subpoena for Amanda Green, the reporter who had written the viral article. She looked uncomfortable as she walked to the stand, her perfectly styled hair and confident posture beginning to crumble under the courtroom lights. Henry's tone remained polite but firm. Miss Green, can you confirm that you published an article titled "Heiress Worth 28 Million Evicts Her Own Parents"? She nodded. Yes. Was the story fact-checked? It was based on credible sources, she replied, though her voice faltered slightly. Henry leaned forward. Did one of those sources happen to be Mrs. Linda Whitmore? She hesitated. She provided background information. Did she also pay you? The courtroom murmured. Amanda shifted uncomfortably. The judge reminded her she was under oath. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke. Yes. She paid me to run it. The air went still. My mother's face turned pale, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. The judge's gavel struck once for order. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Thomas broke first. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice shaking with rage. I only did it because of Eric's debts. He was drowning, and no one else would help him. Henry didn't move, but the court clerk typed every word into the record. It was a confession. The judge took a deep breath. Mr. Whitmore, you may want to consult your counsel before speaking further. But Thomas didn't stop. You think she deserves all this? She's just a child with a conscience too small for real life. The judge's voice rose slightly. That's enough. He fell silent, breathing heavily. Eric stared at the floor. Linda dabbed her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. The rest of the hearing moved quickly after that. Henry summarized the evidence with the precision of a surgeon. Every document, every recording, every confession, placed neatly into the record. When it ended, the judge took a long pause, then spoke. The court finds that the last will and testament of Walter and Evelyn Whitmore is valid and binding. The assets shall remain under the name of Miss Clara May Whitmore. Any further attempt to interfere with her inheritance will be considered a violation of state law. The words hung in the air like a final verdict in more ways than one. My father's shoulders slumped. Linda stared straight ahead. Eric walked out before the judge had even finished speaking. When it was over, Henry gathered the papers with quiet care. Rosa put a hand on my shoulder. You did it, she whispered, but I didn't feel victorious, just empty. As we stepped out of the courthouse, the wind hit my face, sharp and cold. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, but their voices felt far away. In the distance, I could see my parents walking toward their car. Not looking back once, I stood on the steps for a long moment, watching their figures fade into the gray afternoon. My voice, steady and quiet, echoed in my mind. I didn't want to defeat them, I just didn't want them to destroy me anymore. Then I turned away from the cameras, the noise, and the crowd, and walked into the quiet that waited for me. Chapter 8. The True Legacy. 6 months passed, and Aspen Ridge softened back into the quiet rhythm I remembered from childhood. The snow melted into wildflowers that spread across the hills, and the air carried that clean mountain scent I had missed for years. The town had stopped whispering about the trial long ago. People still nodded politely when they saw me at the grocery store or the coffee shop, but their curiosity had faded, replaced by the kind of respect that didn't need words. I resigned from Whitmore Freight 3 weeks after the verdict. There were no headlines this time, no statements or public letters. I simply walked into Henry's office, handed him the papers, and told him I wanted to build something smaller, something that felt like it mattered. He smiled and said he had been waiting for me to say that. The house felt different now. It was still old and full of creaks, but the heaviness had lifted. I kept my grandparents' photos on the mantel, and their journals stayed on the desk where I first found them. The ledger, though, I locked away. Some stories didn't need retelling. With Rosa's help, I started the Whitmore Education Foundation. It began with a single idea scribbled on a notepad one evening. Give them what I had, a chance. We spent months meeting with local schools, talking to teachers, reviewing applications. By summer, we had selected the first group of students to receive scholarships, $10 million, carefully invested, dedicated to helping kids who never had the chance to dream big. The first ceremony took place in the town's small community hall. It wasn't grand or glamorous, but the air buzzed with laughter and the smell of fresh flowers. Carlos stood by the door, greeting guests, his daughter Elena helping with the name tags. Henry arrived carrying a basket of warm bread from a bakery in Denver, saying it was a lawyer's version of champagne. Rosa handled the microphone, her voice calm and steady as she spoke about the foundation's mission. I watched from the side of the stage, hands folded in front of me. When my name was called, I stepped up to the podium. The crowd applauded softly, their faces warm, expectant. I cleared my throat. 6 months ago, I didn't think I'd ever stand here, I began. Back then, legacy meant money, buildings, ownership. But now I see it differently. Legacy isn't about what you keep, it's about what you give. I glanced toward the front row, where a young girl sat clutching her mother's hand. Her name was Maria Torres. She was 17, the daughter of a housekeeper, and she wanted to study engineering. When I called her up, she walked carefully, her shoes scuffed, her smile bright enough to light the whole room. I handed her the scholarship certificate and a check. Her hands trembled as she took them. "Thank you," she whispered. I smiled. "No, Maria, thank you. Make it count." The audience clapped, and she hugged me before walking off the stage. For a moment, I thought about Evelyn and Walter, how proud they would have been to see this room full of hope. After the ceremony ended, people lingered, laughing and sharing stories. Henry poured coffee for Carlos and teased Rosa about her speech. Elena danced to the music playing through the old speakers. I stood by the window, looking out at the golden light spilling across the mountains, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The night air was cool, and the stars seemed endless. I thought about everything that had happened, about the cost of truth, and the strange mercy of time. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who stays when everyone else leaves. Inside the house, the old intercom light flickered faintly. I walked over and pressed the button. It still worked. For a moment, I almost expected to hear Evelyn's voice again, her gentle hum as she called me in for dinner. But there was only the soft crackle of static, the quiet kind that feels almost alive. I smiled and turned it off. Some echoes were meant to rest. Before heading upstairs, I opened the window and let the cool air in. The world outside was calm again. The company was no longer mine, and I didn't want it to be. What I had built instead felt truer, cleaner. I once thought legacy was money. Now I know it's how you help others believe in good again. And maybe, somewhere, that's what my grandparents wanted all along. If you've stayed with me through this story, tell me, what does legacy mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this speak to you, remember to stay close. More stories of truth, justice, and quiet redemption are waiting here for you.